At first, this Avatar short looks like a simple little adventure. No dialogue, no big battle, and no complicated plot. Just Aang, his friends, Momo, and a peaceful forest. But the moment you actually pay attention to what is happening, you realize this little story is built around one very simple thing: curiosity. The short opens with something that immediately stands out from the peaceful forest around it. Hidden near a tree is a strange container filled with bright golden honey. Everything around it looks completely calm, but the way the camera focuses on that honey tells us that it is going to become important. Then we see Aang with his friends moving through the area. They aren't in the middle of some huge Avatar mission. They are just exploring, which makes the whole situation feel more like one of those small adventures Team Avatar could have between the major events of the series. And that's actually one of the coolest things about this style of Avatar story. The original series was filled with massive conflicts. There was a war happening, the Fire Nation was chasing them, and Aang had the fate of the entire world sitting on his shoulders. But the characters also had ordinary moments. They ate together, they traveled together, they got distracted, they made stupid decisions, and sometimes they got themselves into trouble over something completely ridiculous. This short takes that side of Avatar and turns it into a full comedy. As Aang and the others move through the forest, they notice something unusual. Instead of simply walking past it, they stop and investigate. And that decision is where the trouble starts. Because somewhere nearby is a very angry little creature. At first, it doesn't look like much. But once it appears, Aang realizes that this isn't just some harmless animal hanging around the forest. It is connected to the honey. And suddenly, what looked like a peaceful little discovery becomes a chase. Aang tries to move away, but the creature doesn't exactly seem interested in letting him go. This is where the animation really leans into Aang's personality. He's powerful enough to fight some of the strongest people in the Avatar world, but that doesn't mean every problem needs to become a serious battle. Aang is naturally playful and curious, so when something unexpected happens, his first instinct isn't always to destroy it. Sometimes he just reacts like a normal kid who accidentally walked into a ridiculous situation. And that's exactly what makes the comedy work. The short then shifts its attention toward Momo. And honestly, this is where everything becomes even more predictable. Because if there is one thing you should never leave unattended around Momo, it's food. Momo spots the golden honey and immediately becomes interested. And you can almost tell what he's thinking without him saying a single word. He wants it. There is no complicated plan, no strategy, no heroic mission. Just Momo seeing something delicious and deciding that he needs to get his hands on it. He moves toward the honey and starts enjoying himself, completely unaware of how much trouble this tiny snack is about to cause. And this is a perfect example of why Momo works so well in Avatar. Momo isn't a powerful bender. He isn't a warrior. He isn't some legendary creature that can save the world. He's just Momo. But because he behaves like a mischievous little animal, he can create problems that even Aang has to deal with. Then the environment changes again. The peaceful forest gives way to a much more suspicious-looking area, and we get a better sense that the honey isn't just sitting there randomly. There are flowers, trees, a natural environment that feels like the perfect home for the creatures protecting that honey. And that's important because the short isn't really treating the animals as villains. They're protecting what belongs to them. From their perspective, Aang and his friends are the ones invading their space. That's what makes the situation funny. Nobody is really evil. Nobody is trying to conquer anything. One group wants the honey. The other group wants them to stay away from it. And Momo just wants a snack. But then the situation gets completely out of control. The creatures begin appearing in greater numbers. And what started as one small encounter suddenly turns into a much bigger problem. Aang and his friends are forced to deal with the consequences of getting too close. And this is where the short starts setting up its biggest joke. Because the more they try to control the situation, the worse it gets. And the funniest part is that the entire mess could probably have been avoided if everyone had simply left the honey alone. But of course, that would not be an Avatar story. And Momo definitely isn't going to learn that lesson anytime soon. Because the honey is still there. And the swarm is getting bigger. And Aang is about to discover that sometimes the smallest problems can become the biggest headaches. And that's where this little adventure really starts to spiral out of control. The situation gets much worse when the creatures realize someone has taken their honey. What looked like one small problem suddenly turns into a full-on swarm. Dozens of these strange, honey-loving creatures appear in the sky, and now Aang and the others aren't dealing with one angry little animal anymore. They're dealing with an entire army. And this is where the short becomes much more chaotic. Aang tries to figure out what to do, while the others react in their own completely different ways. Zuko, of course, looks like he's ready to treat the situation as an actual threat. But the problem is that there isn't really an enemy to defeat. These creatures aren't invading the group for no reason. They're protecting their food. The more the group interferes, the more aggressive the swarm becomes. And that creates the perfect setup for the comedy because every attempt to fix the situation only makes things worse. Then we get one of the funniest details in the entire short. The honey itself becomes almost like a weapon. It gets thrown through the air, splashes across the forest, and suddenly the entire environment is covered in this bright golden mess. Instead of a normal bending battle with fire, water, or earth, the characters are basically trying to survive a flying honey disaster. And that's what makes this short feel so different from a normal Avatar episode. There is no world-ending threat here. There is no Fire Nation army. There is no powerful villain. The characters are simply caught in a ridiculous situation that keeps escalating. Then Aang spots another problem. The swarm isn't staying in one place. The creatures are moving through the forest and following the group, which means running away isn't really solving anything. And eventually, the chase brings them toward the rest of the team. This is where the short starts bringing the characters together. Aang, Zuko, and the others are all forced to react at the same time, and because there is no dialogue, their body language becomes extremely important. You can understand what they're thinking just from their expressions. Aang looks confused and concerned. Zuko looks irritated and ready to fight. The others are trying to figure out how to get out of the situation. And then there's Momo, who somehow remains focused on the one thing that caused all of this in the first place. The food. That is probably the funniest character detail in the whole story. Everyone else is thinking about survival, while Momo is basically thinking, but what about the honey? And honestly, that's completely in character. Momo has always been curious, mischievous, and extremely motivated by food. So even when everything around him is falling apart, he still finds a way to make the situation about himself. But then the swarm gets even larger. The creatures cover the sky, and suddenly the characters have almost nowhere to go. At this point, Aang has to use his bending to create an escape. And this is where we get to see something important about the short's animation style. The bending isn't being used as a serious combat technique. It's being used almost like a cartoon superpower. Aang creates air currents and tries to move everyone out of danger, but the swarm keeps coming. The comedy comes from the fact that Aang is technically the most powerful person in the group, yet even he can't simply solve this problem with one attack. Because what exactly is he supposed to do? Blast the creatures away? Destroy their home? That would completely defeat the point. The problem isn't strength. It's understanding the situation. And that is actually a very Avatar-like idea hidden inside a silly comedy short. Aang's greatest strength isn't always overwhelming power. Sometimes it's his ability to find a peaceful solution. But before he can do that, the group has to escape the swarm. And this is where Appa finally becomes important. With the creature still chasing them, the group reaches Appa and realizes that their best option is to get out of the area as quickly as possible. Appa becomes their escape vehicle, carrying everyone away while the swarm continues following them. For a moment, it looks like they've finally found a way out. But the honey has created one final problem. The scent is still attracting the creatures. So even though they're moving away from the forest, the danger hasn't completely disappeared. And now the entire group is essentially trapped in a flying chase with a swarm of angry honey creatures. The funniest part is that none of this needed to happen. If they had simply left the honey alone, they could have walked through the forest, climbed onto Appa, and continued their journey like nothing happened. Instead, curiosity turned into greed, greed turned into a chase, and the chase turned into complete chaos. But just when it looks like the group is finally going to escape, something happens that changes the entire situation. Because the real solution isn't about fighting the creatures. It's about figuring out exactly what they want. And once Aang understands that, the final part of this little adventure becomes even more ridiculous. The final part begins with Aang realizing that fighting the creatures is never going to solve the problem. The swarm isn't attacking because it wants to hurt them. It's reacting because the group has something the creatures want. And that changes everything. Instead of trying to overpower the swarm, Aang starts looking for a way to give them what they're actually after. The honey. This is where the whole adventure comes full circle. What started as a simple discovery has turned into complete chaos. And the solution is surprisingly simple. The group needs to stop treating the creatures like enemies and understand why they're chasing them in the first place. Once the honey is no longer being treated like a prize, the creatures begin to calm down. And suddenly, the massive chase that looked like it was going to turn into a huge battle starts falling apart. This is also where the short quietly reminds us what makes Aang different from a typical action hero. Aang has access to incredible power, but his first instinct isn't always to destroy whatever is standing in front of him. He's someone who would rather understand the problem and find a peaceful solution. That's a major part of his character throughout Avatar. Even when he's powerful enough to win a fight, he doesn't necessarily believe that fighting is the best answer. And in a silly little story about honey, that personality trait still matters. Meanwhile, Momo has basically been responsible for half of the chaos without ever realizing it. His curiosity started the entire situation. His obsession with the honey kept making things worse, and somehow he still ends up looking completely innocent by the end. That's classic Momo. He doesn't need dialogue to be funny. His expressions, movements, and reactions tell the entire story. And that's one of the reasons silent animation can work so well with characters like these. You don't need someone explaining what Momo is thinking. You can see it. You don't need Aang to say that he's confused. His expression tells you. You don't need Zuko to complain about the situation. His face practically does the talking for him. Every character communicates through movement and reaction. Once the creatures finally stop chasing them, the group gets a moment to breathe. After all that chaos, they're finally safe. And that's when you realize just how ridiculous the entire adventure actually was. There was no villain, no major threat, no complicated mystery. It was just a group of friends discovering something they shouldn't have messed with and then dealing with the consequences. But that's exactly why these smaller Avatar stories can be so entertaining. The Avatar universe doesn't always need a world-ending conflict to be interesting. Sometimes the most memorable moments can come from the characters simply being themselves. Aang is curious. Momo is mischievous. Zuko is constantly annoyed. And the rest of the group is forced to deal with whatever disaster happens next. The short also captures something that made the original Avatar series so special. The chemistry between the characters. Even when they're not fighting a major enemy, you can still feel that they're a team. They travel together, react to problems together, and somehow survive the ridiculous situations they keep getting themselves into. And this little honey adventure is basically a miniature version of that formula. It starts with something harmless, introduces a small problem, lets the characters make things worse, and then ends with them figuring out a way out together. That's why the story works even without dialogue. You can understand the entire situation through the animation itself. The expressions, the body language, the camera movement, the reactions, and the timing all work together to tell the story. And honestly, that's probably the biggest reason this kind of Avatar animation is so enjoyable. It doesn't try to recreate a huge war or another massive battle. Instead, it takes the characters we already know and puts them into a completely ridiculous situation. And sometimes that's all you need, because after watching Aang fight powerful enemies, master the elements, and eventually face the Fire Lord, seeing him struggle with something as simple as an angry swarm of honey creatures is actually refreshing. It reminds us that underneath all the bending, mythology, and massive world building, these characters are still just a group of friends traveling together and getting into trouble. And Momo? Well, Momo is probably going to do it all over again the next time he sees something that looks delicious. So in the end, this wasn't really a story about honey. It was a story about curiosity, consequences, friendship, and the hilarious personalities of Team Avatar. Aang didn't need the Avatar state. Zuko didn't need firebending. The group didn't need some legendary weapon. They just needed to understand what was happening before the situation got completely out of control. And somehow they survived another ridiculous adventure. That's what makes this little Avatar short so fun. It takes a simple idea, gives every character a chance to react, adds a little chaos, and turns it into a story that feels completely at home in the Avatar universe. And even without a single line of dialogue, the characters still manage to tell us everything we need to know.